Now it's time for Perspective, and it's a book that's been described in The Observer as a gripping account of an intriguing and little-known Cold War moment. It is a book that tells the astonishing story of the 10 million books that were smuggled across the Iron Curtain during and after the Second World War. Those books making across the longest and most heavily guarded border on Earth. Well, joining us now is the author of the book, The CIA Book Club, the best kept secret of the Cold War, Charlie English. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme. I'm going to ask you, first of all, to do something impossible. Tell us what this story is. Summarise your entire book, if you can, just by explaining what on earth was going on in this.
Absolutely. So during the Cold War, as you probably know, half of Europe was occupied by effectively the Soviet Union, or were captive nations, as the Americans called them. And in these states, there was a very draconian system of censorship. So in Poland, for instance, if you so much as wanted to have a business card printed, you needed to get permission from the main office of control, which was the censorship body in the country. So the Americans and the CIA were very aware of this, and they put a lot of effort into breaking this iron grip that the party had on people in the East. And they had radio stations. There was Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which targeted particular parts of the Eastern Bloc. But the book program grew out of those that desire to break the censorship, and it started in the mid-1950s, and it ran for around about 35 years. And in that time infiltrated, as you say, about 10 million books through the Iron Curtain. These were a kind of enormous range of different titles. There were political texts like George Orwell, for instance, was a great favorite. Camus was sent, anti-totalitarian texts by Hannah Arendt, but also much more soft literature, if you like, lifestyle magazines, fashion magazines. And the idea was to give a sense of this great diversity and pluralism that existed in the West.
And how were they actually able to do it? Because it was coordinated, if you like, wasn't it, from offices in the US, but then many activists locally were actually doing the work on the ground, as it were.
Absolutely. So it was based in Manhattan, in Park Avenue South. There was an office there. But it essentially was an enormous network of largely émigrés. So in London, Paris, Vienna, Rome, etc., there would be, for instance, Polish bookshops. And Paris was home to a couple of very important Polish bookshops for this program. One was the Librairie Polonaise on Boulevard Saint-Germain, which at one point was half of its turnover was being bought by the CIA. And people who would come from the Eastern Bloc, tourists and travelers, and they could take free books home from these distribution points in the West.
Didn't always go to plan, of course, did it?
No. There was some smuggling operations, like there was a vehicle that they constructed, the Paris Poles constructed, which had a secret compartment which could carry books and printing presses and inks, because later on this program was also supporting underground presses in Poland and elsewhere. So they built this truck which was driven regularly through the Iron Curtain and secretly unloaded in Poland. And in March 1984, some customs officer in Poland spotted that it was slightly different dimensions inside the cargo bay than it was outside. And they ripped through the wall and found all these books and printing presses. And the driver, who was a Frenchman called Jacques Chalot, was arrested and held in jail for some time.
It was incredible, the lengths they went to. I mean, George Wyndham, the head of the CIA operation, I mean, he aimed, didn't he, to kind of win the Cold War with literature. I mean, is that sort of overstating it? How much of a difference did it actually make?
Well, I think it made a big difference. I mean, I wouldn't like to claim that it won the Cold War. There were many factors involved in that, not least the sort of failing Eastern economies and the war in Afghanistan. But I spent a lot of time in Poland, which was a very enthusiastic recipient of these books. And in Poland, Poland, of course, was the first East European communist regime to fall in 1989. And the effect of this program on Poland was immense. I mean, there was so much literature washing around Poland, so much uncensored literature, that by the mid to late 1980s, the Polish regime had really lost control of the argument completely. They could no longer hold this kind of firewall, if you like, of preventing people from getting information about, for instance, what the Russians had done to them in the Second World War, and how incompetent the Polish communist regime was. So this, it sort of built up this kind of intellectual class, if you like, of solidarity dissidents who had all been brought up on these books, and knew how things worked in the West. And I think that had a very important effect or impetus to change the way things were in Poland. And in fact, a leading dissident told me that it was books that had won the war, as far as he was concerned.
And it's incredible that it went on so long after the war, isn't it? As you said earlier, it's a period of 35 years.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was a tremendously long-running and successful operation, and in its later phases, it became, as I hinted earlier, it became more of an operation to support printing within the Eastern Bloc itself. So there was this kind of great flowering of underground presses in the Eastern Bloc. So people were producing their own literature. They didn't need the smuggled books necessarily. They could print uncensored publications within Poland.
Charlie, finally, I wanted to ask you a bit about yourself as well. I know you've written 3 books now, and you were at one point the head of international news at The Guardian. What's the difference? I mean, how do you make that transition, if you like, from journalism to being a book writer? And what was it for you that led you down that path?
Well, I'd always wanted to be a writer of books, really. I found journalism fascinating, but as you, I'm sure, are aware, it's quite short term. So you go into the office one morning and then everything's over by the evening, and then you start again in the morning.
Particularly at the moment, yes.
Exactly, yes. So I wanted a bit more to get my teeth into something a bit more, in a bit more depth, I guess. And my first of these books was about Al-Qaeda and Timbuktu, and I was fascinated by that story, and I just wanted to spend a couple of years researching it, which is what I did, and I've just kept on going.
Good to hear your story as well, Charlie. Thank you very much. Charlie English joining us there from London. His book, The CIA Book Club, The Best Kept Secret of the Cold War, putting the rest of us journalists for shame. He's quite right. A little bit more depth, always needed, isn't it, here on France 24.